When building a wire harness for your installation, there are some special tools and materials that you will use. Hi, I'm Chris from Garmin. In this video, we will go over some of those with you. Part of any wire harness installation is going to be making sure your wires are the proper length for the run. You don't want to overcurrent your wires by having too much in a system. And for that, of course, we'll use wire cutters. Your traditional diagonal cuts offer a blade that does not meet at a flush cutting surface and thereby creates a diagonal in the wire every time they're used. Your flush cuts, available from your favorite commercial retailer or even a hobby store, have a flush shearing surface so that the wire is clean every single time. The most important part of any wire harness is preparation. In order to crimp or strip a wire, we need to make sure that the insulation jacket is properly removed. For that, we use insulation jacket scoring tools. There are three types of commercially available jacket scoring tools. First is this twist type, which clamps onto the wire and spins around. Second would be considered something like a hobby knife. And third is your standard razor blade, single-edged. Insert the wire into the tool to its appropriate depth. Spin it around and then pull it clear. You can see why this would be undesirable because it has a chance of scoring and fraying your shielding wires. Your hobby knife, much like your razor blade, simply push the wire onto it so it scores a solid line. And then, as you can see here, you can push that score mark separate from the wire. And when you strip off your installation, your shields are kept nice and clean and unperturbed. And then, of course, last, we have the single edge razor, which you'll do the same. Push along and spin, being careful not to cut yourself. When you push, you see the insulation is broken, and just like previously, the shielding is unperturbed. Now that we have cut our wires to length and removed the insulation jackets, it's time to strip our wires for termination. We have essentially three commercially available flavors. We've got your standard manual, available at your local hardware store or home improvement place. You simply find the appropriate gauge as marked on the side, put it in there, and pull it off. You can see the insulation is left in the cutting blades. And you can also see that, typically speaking, damage has been done to the internal or core wires of your hookup. Your next two options are considered automatic wire strippers. That's because the stripping action is done by the tool while your hands are typically away from the surfaces. These are considered straight cut or edge blades because if you put your finger too close to them, you will cut yourself. But you can see that the gauges are appropriate for aviation because they're smaller. These have little ridges on the jaws, which when you clamp your wire to strip it, you can see where it cuts cleanly around the insulation, but it can also indent the insulation. And in some cases, this can penetrate through, exposing raw wire, which is also undesirable. Your professional tool trucks usually have some kind of automatic stripper that has the flat jaws, so no ridges back here, and captive blades. Again, smaller wire gauges as appropriate for aviation, and captive blades meaning the cutting surface is internal or inside a ridged area so that when you strip your wires, only the insulation is cut and there's no indentations. You can see the core wires are 100% preserved and in most cases still retain their original twist. Let's talk terminations. We've got your standard ring terminal crimpers. Again, going back to our manual wire strippers, they usually have some kind of crimper in there, outlined by the type of crimp you're supposed to execute by the dots. Then we've got your commercially available multi-crimp tool, or your extreme example that might be available only in a shop. We've got your environmental splice tool, which is going to be specific to your environmental splices, again outlined by color coding and the gauge of wire used in the given splices. And then of course we have your standard wire termination and positioner used for applying your pins or sockets for your connectors. Heat guns are going to be a necessary part of any harness assembly, either for shrinking your heat shrink tubing to reestablish your insulation jacket or for completing your environmental splices. Use of a commercially available heat gun is advisable because it's directing the heat directly towards your work area, keeping your hands safe, and they are temperature specific and therefore will melt your environmental splice, your heat shrink tubing, or your solder sleeves, and do it in such a way that does not disturb the integrity of the splice or the termination. As an alternative to the heat shrink solder splices and physical termination splices we've been speaking of previously, you might choose to use a soldering tool. In this case, any commercially available 25 watts minimum soldering tool is acceptable. Also make sure you're using an approved solder. Now that you are more familiar with some of the tools used, we invite you to view the rest of our series where we go over the construction of your wire harness.